The server put a blank place card in front of me, while my grandmother's memorial candles were still burning. Not Adeline Carr, just Adeline. The dinner was held in the long gallery at Carr House, beneath portraits of people who had spent 2 centuries turning cruelty into tradition. A photographer moved along the table, then stopped beside my chair. My cousin Graham was greeting donors as the future head of the Carr Legacy Foundation. Every witness who mattered could see the missing name. I looked at the old women watching from the far end of the table, at cousins studying their crystal glasses, and at the blank space where my belonging had been. This was not only a memorial for Eleanor Carr, it was a vote on who would still count as Carr now that she could no longer stop them. Beatrice Carr did not even bother to lie when I asked what had happened to my full name. She laid 2 fingers on the blank card and said, "The principal Carrs will be photographed together after dessert. The record needs to be clear." Then she told the server to collect my original card before any photograph could circulate with a misleading impression of lineage. Around me, cutlery continued touching porcelain. The photographer lowered his camera. They had chosen the font, the witnesses, and the exact hour when refusing them would look hysterical. They did not know that the locked walnut door upstairs held a final answer Eleanor had prepared for anyone arrogant enough to erase me before coffee service. Graham Carr, my cousin, and the man the family had been polishing into heir apparent since prep school, leaned toward me with the expression of someone performing compassion for his own reflection. He said no one was denying that I had been useful to Eleanor Carr. Useful. That word burned hotter than the insult itself. I had spent 14 years indexing her letters, preserving the family ledgers, interviewing old staff members before memory left them, and protecting the stories everyone liked to quote at charity galas without ever admitting who had saved those stories from mildew and forgetting. Yet there he sat, telling me that what mattered tonight was clarity. He said donors were present. The press had already asked which Carr would oversee the historical foundation next season, and it would be easier for everyone if I stopped confusing personal devotion with hereditary standing. I could still feel the ridge of the archive key in my handbag while he said it. My grandmother had pressed that key into my palm after her second stroke and told me some families only sound noble because women do the editing. I had thought she was warning me about the future in the abstract. Sitting under the memorial portrait, while Graham asked me to return my own surname like borrowed jewelry, I understood she had been handing me instructions. The truly obscene part was the timing. The memorial booklet included a page praising Eleanor Carr as the guardian of Carr continuity, and every sentence on it had been lifted from notes I wrote during her final winter. I had drafted those lines while she slept in the blue morning room, her hands thin, but still elegant, her mind moving in clear bursts whenever family politics had not yet exhausted her. I was the one who remembered which brother sold half the vineyards to rescue the shipyard, which aunt financed the scholarship wing with money she was never publicly thanked for, which secrets had already destroyed one generation because the wrong men were allowed to narrate the truth. Yet at her own memorial dinner, the people consuming my work had decided the woman who built that page should sit beneath it without a last name. My grief kept colliding with rage in a way that made my vision strangely bright. I was heartbroken enough to want my grandmother back for one impossible minute. I was furious enough to know I could not let these people treat the archive of my whole life as proof that I belonged only when I stayed silent. So I did the smallest thing possible, and it felt larger than any speech. I took the blank place card, turned it over, and wrote Carr on the back in my grandmother's dark fountain pen, the one I had tucked into my bag because I could not bear to leave it in the study yet. My hand did not shake. That detail matters to me. I was hurt and I was humiliated, but I was not broken open for their entertainment. When Beatrice Carr noticed the pen stroke, her expression tightened by 1 degree, the way old money women react when they realize control is slipping in a room they believed had already been secured. I told her quietly that I would not surrender any card tonight, and if the family wanted to discuss records, we could do it in front of the archive after the guests were gone. That was the first moment Graham Carr looked afraid instead of superior. He knew what I meant. He knew there were sealed materials upstairs. He just believed, the way this family always had, that my loyalty would be stronger than my pain. As the string quartet moved into another hymn my grandmother never liked, I understood the real contest beginning under the memorial flowers. They were asking me to accept removal. I was deciding whether the family's version of history would survive contact with the one person who actually knew where its bones were buried. After my parents died, Eleanor brought me to Carr House at 15. She gave me a room, a fixed breakfast hour, and work in Hawthorne Archive Room. The room was full of damaged boxes nobody else wanted. I restored labels, transcribed letters, and recorded former staff before their memories were gone. Eleanor sat beside me with tea and corrected the family myths. She never called me her assistant. She called me her keeper. 3 years before the memorial, Eleanor put the archive key and a sealed envelope into my hand. Maeve Larkin, her attorney, witnessed it. "They will not come for your work first," Eleanor said. "They will come for your belonging. That is cheaper." She told me to open the letter if the family ever challenged my place in the archive publicly. I kept duplicate catalog records off-site from that day forward. Beatrice had always wanted me useful and unseen. Graham liked my work as long as he could call it help. In the week before the memorial, I asked whether Eleanor's archive dedication would name the women who had preserved the collection. Beatrice said, "Memorials should not be crowded with competing narratives." Graham added that donors needed a clean emotional line. They had already decided the family story would be cleaner without me in it. The lies started before the last condolence arrangement was removed from the front hall. By the next morning, cousins were telling guests that I had requested a simpler card out of humility. I drove back to the estate with my laptop and backup drive. In the service corridor, Jonah Pembroke slipped a folded printout into my hand. Preceding versions existed. My name carried Carr on the first 3. The final revision, time-stamped 4 hours before guests arrived, included a note from Beatrice: "Surname usage restricted to principal line descendants for photographic clarity." The first proof arrived before the flowers had wilted. The insult had been designed, approved, and timed for the camera. Jonah showed me one more screen before he left. The family communications office had sent a memorial photograph to the local paper that morning. In the image, the table had been cropped so tightly that my chair disappeared. Under it, the caption read, "Eleanor Carr's direct family gathers to honor her legacy." My phone began filling with messages from people who thought I had not attended. I called the editor, sent the photograph I had taken before dinner, and asked him not to correct it yet. A public lie is easier to challenge when it stays visible long enough to prove it was a choice. Jonah was the one who pushed me toward the sealed materials when instinct still wanted me to beg for decency. He met me in Hawthorne Archive Room after dusk with the look of a man who had spent too many years surviving other people's dynastic tempers. He said the family office had already asked whether the private boxes needed to be inventoried again before the upcoming benefit. That question, coming so quickly, told us everything. They were not simply trying to humiliate me out of sentiment. They were moving toward control of the record itself. I unlocked the walnut cabinet with the key my grandmother gave me, pulled out the sealed envelope, and called Maeve Larkin from the reading desk where I had spent half my adult life. She arrived 40 minutes later carrying a folder and the expression of someone who had expected this day and still hated being right. In the envelope was a signed letter from Eleanor Carr appointing me as sole keeper of the Family Historical Archive until such time as an independent public institution accepted the collection under the stewardship terms she had drafted. The line that made my throat close was not the appointment itself. It was the reason she wrote beneath it. Adeline remembers that history is not public relations. Therefore, she must protect this family from the descendants who will try to use memory as costume. I wish I could say the letter gave me instant courage. What it really gave me was responsibility, heavy enough to terrify me. Being named keeper meant I was no longer defending my own feelings. I was defending my grandmother's final act of judgment against a room full of people who had more money, better social armor, and a lifetime of experience making women doubt what they knew. Maeve Larkin told me that the appointment would not matter if I let the family seize the boxes before the record was stabilized. Jonah quietly pointed out that half the digital catalogs still lived on my backups and could be authenticated against the archive timestamps. I stood there surrounded by labeled cartons and leather-bound journals, thinking not about strategy first, but about my grandmother's hands folding that paper while knowing exactly what sort of battle she was leaving behind. The grief came then, sharp and humiliating and private. I cried for less than a minute, wiped my face, and got back to work. That matters too. I was never the collapsed victim they wanted me to become. I was wounded, yes, but even in the middle of that wound, I was already choosing sequence, evidence, witnesses, and timing. My sadness was real. My discipline survived it. Graham Carr tried to buy my obedience before the family moved to threats, which told me he still believed I could be managed with the right balance of condescension and reward. He invited me to breakfast at the club, where Carr men like to perform civility under portraits of dead industrialists, then slid a typed proposal across the linen tablecloth, as though we were negotiating over antique chairs instead of my entire place in the family narrative. If I signed a transitional stewardship memo acknowledging his branch as the public face of the archive, the family would fund an apartment for me, retain me as a historical consultant, and respect my long service in future materials. Long service. That was how he translated daughterhood, work, memory, and grief once money entered the room. I asked whether the proposal restored my name on the memorial record. He said that detail would only inflame matters. I asked whether it acknowledged my grandmother's letter. He looked at me for a long time and said private preferences should not be allowed to destabilize the principal line. Then he made the betrayal unmistakable. He said he had personally approved Beatrice's final seating revision because donors needed to see him, not me, as Eleanor's successor. There it was, finally plain. He had known what the surname meant, promised to protect my place after Eleanor died, and chose the family image anyway. The next blow landed where the family's ambitions always live: public image. Carr House was weeks away from unveiling a major legacy exhibition tied to Carr Legacy Winter Benefit, an annual philanthropic spectacle where the family sold nostalgia to donors as if virtue came engraved with the crest. I had built the core chronology for that exhibition. My notes shaped the captions. My oral history transcripts had rescued half the stories they planned to tell from total loss. Yet when Jonah downloaded the latest preview deck, the historical credit line named Graham as archival director and referred to me only in a buried acknowledgement as a former research assistant. That was the moment anger simplified into mission. This stopped being about reclaiming a chair at a dinner table. It became about preventing the family from using my grandmother's death to launder a false bloodline narrative into permanent public fact. The exhibition was not a side issue. It was the battlefield. If they debuted their version first, my evidence would look reactive. If I intervened before the benefit, their whole engine of legitimacy would falter in front of exactly the witnesses they cared about most. I did not need revenge in the loud theatrical sense. I needed the truth placed where their money could not mute it. Before I could leave the estate, 2 security officers appeared at the archive door with a cardboard box and an inventory sheet. One of them had worked at Carr House since I was 16. He would not meet my eyes. The sheet said my desk was being cleared because I no longer had research access. A junior assistant carried out my pencil cup, my nameplate, and the blue gloves Eleanor had bought for me when my hands were too small for the archive work. Graham stood at the end of the hall and watched while they packed the drawer. He did not have to say anything. The action was the message. No access, no desk, no visible proof that I had ever belonged there. I photographed every item before the box left the room. Then I took the duplicate accession cards from my bag and gave them to Iris. Even then, the family underestimated what kind of woman they had built by relegating me to the background for so long. I knew where the duplicate accession cards were stored. I knew which conservator had restored the war letters and kept chain of custody notes. I knew which donor had promised funding only because my grandmother personally described the archive as a living record rather than a vanity hall. Most importantly, I knew where the family myths were weakest because I had spent years repairing them on paper. Iris Denton, a museum registrar who once interned with me and now had more institutional courage than three car men put together, agreed to review the metadata trail on my backups. Maeve Larkin began assembling witness letters. Jonah copied the last clean export of the catalog before the family office could revise it. Every hour that passed made the insult at the memorial dinner look less like a social wound and more like the opening move in a coordinated theft of authorship, grief, and belonging. Once I saw the full shape, I stopped wishing for apology. I wanted interruption. I wanted the family to lose the ability to present erasure as housekeeping. The 4 days before Carr legacy winter benefit felt like living inside a clock I had built myself. I worked from dawn until my shoulders locked, verifying box numbers against scans, matching my grandmother's marginal notes to the printed exhibition captions, flagging every place where the family had sanded me out of the record without understanding that the trail of removal was itself part of the evidence. Iris Denton found version, histories showing Graham's office requested late changes after my grandmother's death. Jonah produced courier receipts proving the sealed boxes were moved for photography without my authorization. Maeve Larkin contacted the independent conservator, who confirmed that my handwritten condition notes had been copied into the final exhibit binders. None of these pieces alone would have pierced car polish. Together, they told us story donors could understand without knowing our intimate family wounds. The woman who preserved the legacy had been pushed out, so the approved branch could wear her labor as birthright. I was careful not to let the documents turn me into someone colder than myself. I kept returning to the real center of the matter. They had tried to remove my name while borrowing my voice. Every file I assembled was a way of saying I still existed in my own life. The family retaliated in all the elegant ways cowards prefer. My estate gate code was deactivated. A junior staffer called to say access to my archive desk was suspended pending internal review. An old school friend, now married to one of Graham's investors, warned me over lunch that I was being described as unstable in donor circles, too attached, too emotional, too confused about what constituted actual lineage. The language was insulting, but it also made me smile for the first time since the memorial. Whenever people like the Carrs reach for a woman's mental stability, it means the factual route is getting thin beneath their feet. I did not respond publicly. I documented everything. Then I moved the most sensitive boxes to a climate-controlled room at Iris Denton's museum under temporary intake paperwork authorized by Maeve Larkin using my grandmother's stewardship letter. Carrying those cartons out of the estate service entrance while the hydrangeas were being refreshed for donors felt almost surreal. For years, I had protected the family from outside scrutiny by keeping its memory intact. Now, I was protecting its memory from the family itself. The reversal began there, not in a ballroom, but in the stubborn physical fact that history travels with whoever is willing to lift it carefully and tell the truth about what it contains. At noon, I returned for the one thing I had not moved, Eleanor's final oral history recording. She had made it the winter before she died, sitting in the blue morning room and naming the people who had truly kept Carr House alive. The audio cabinet was open. The labeled drive was gone. A staffer handed me a disposal form with Beatrice's signature at the bottom. Mrs. Carr said the recording was too personal for the exhibition. He whispered. I called Beatrice from the corridor. She said Eleanor's last words should not be used to create confusion. I told her the recording had been backed up the night it was made. For the first time, she stopped speaking. Then she ended the call. That was the cut that made every donor question feel necessary. She had not only erased my name, she had tried to silence Eleanor after death. That evening, Beatrice tried a softer attack. A courier delivered a velvet box containing Eleanor's crest ring and a note asking me to wear it at the benefit as a sign of family unity. Beneath the ring sat a release form. It gave the Carr Legacy Office permanent control of every digitized archive record, including the files Eleanor had placed in my care. Beatrice had turned my grandmother's ring into a handle for the same trap. I put the ring back in the box, signed nothing, and sent the release to Maeve. Within an hour, Maeve filed notice that any attempt to seize the collection would be challenged under Eleanor's stewardship instruction. The next morning, a trustee I barely knew called to ask why the family was suddenly demanding paperwork from its own keeper. The question was small. It was also the first crack in their donor circle. Graham came to the museum before the benefit with no assistance and no polished speech. He placed his hands on the reading room table and said Beatrice was willing to play Eleanor's recording during the opening remarks if I would abandon the public challenge. For 10 seconds, I wanted to believe him. Then I noticed he had brought no signed correction, no restored credit, and no apology for the photograph. He wanted the voice of a dead woman without the truth she had left behind. I pressed play on the backup recording. Eleanor's voice filled the room. Adeline keeps what we were too proud to see. Graham flinched. I turned it off and told him the donors would hear it when they had the rest of the record in front of them. He left without touching the tea Iris had set out. An hour later, Jonah called from the estate loading dock. A private transport van had arrived for 12 framed letters and 2 ledgers from the archive. Beatrice had listed them as legacy gifts for a closed donor dinner after the benefit. The inventory sheet named Graham as the lender. Those were not gifts. They were the pieces of history that proved women outside the principal line had kept the estate alive when Carr men had failed it. Once the letters entered private homes, the family could call their absence an accident. I drove to the gate with Maeve on speakerphone. The driver had already loaded 3 crates. Graham stood beside the van in his dinner jacket, checking his watch. He said the items were only going across town for display. I handed the driver Eleanor's stewardship letter and asked whether he wanted to move property covered by an active preservation notice. He stopped loading at once. Graham reached for the letter, but I folded it and put it back in my coat. Beatrice arrived 5 minutes later. She did not raise her voice. She told the driver the family had always handled its own objects. Maeve, still on speakerphone, asked Beatrice to confirm that statement for the record. Beatrice looked at the phone and said nothing. The driver unloaded every crate. Jonah took photographs while the ledgers returned to the archive table. I called Harold Wexford and told him that the exhibit items had nearly been removed before the board could review them. He did not offer sympathy. He asked for the inventory sheet and the driver's name. By the time I reached the museum again, he had requested that the board chair attend the benefit early. The family had meant to make evidence disappear in a van. Instead, it gave the donors one more reason to ask who was protecting the collection and who was trying to own it. At the museum, Iris placed the returned ledgers in a locked display case and handed me the new intake receipt. Beatrice's attempted transfer was now listed beside the original collection record. I signed the receipt as keeper. The paper made a small, clean sound under my pen. Jonah set the empty transport tags beside the receipt and photographed both documents. The van left the estate without a single ledger. Across the street, Graham stood in the rain beside the closed gate, still wearing the black tie he had chosen for the benefit. I did not wave. I locked the display case, gave Iris the spare key, and started toward the ballroom. That night, after the last box was logged into temporary intake, I sat alone on the museum floor between 2 shelves of uncatalogued maritime maps, and finally let the week catch up with my body. My back ached. My grief felt old and fresh at the same time. I thought about how easy it would be to romanticize this moment later as empowerment, as if choosing myself had felt glamorous while I was doing it. It did not. It felt expensive. It felt lonely. It felt like understanding in my bones that once I walked into the benefit with those documents, I would lose forever the fantasy that the family might one day love me without requiring some elegant form of self-erasure. But there was another truth sitting beside that loneliness. For the first time since my grandmother died, I was acting in alignment with what she had actually taught me instead of what the family hoped I had learned from them. I was grieving her by protecting the record she trusted me with, not by preserving the comfort of people who had already chosen convenience over truth. Beatrice Carr finally called me herself the night before the benefit, which was how I knew the panic had risen high enough to reach the throne room. She did not shout. She spoke in that low, almost maternal tone women like her use when they want coercion to sound like concern. She said grief had made everyone vulnerable to dramatic misunderstandings. She said my grandmother admired my dedication, but never intended for me to confuse personal affection with custodial authority. She said there was still time to present a united family image if I brought the key, the letter, and the remaining boxes back before breakfast. Then she offered what she clearly believed was mercy. If I cooperated, the family would restore my surname on the final printed memorial archive and arrange a private luncheon where my contribution could be acknowledged with dignity. Private again. Always private when my pain was involved, public whenever their power needed protection. I let her finish every polished sentence. Then I said the one thing I had rehearsed all afternoon while driving between storage rooms. You are not asking for family unity, Beatrice. You are asking me to help you counterfeit my grandmother. She inhaled sharply, the first honest sound I had heard from her all week. I hung up before she could recover into poise. At Carr Legacy Winter Benefit, the family expected me either absent or apologetic. I gave them neither. I arrived in charcoal silk, wearing my grandmother's pen at my collar and the calm expression that always frightens shallow people more than rage does. The entrance hall glittered with winter branches, donor plaques, and the sort of theatrical discretion money mistakes for class. On the central wall hung a preview panel for the exhibition with Graham's name under the heading Legacy Steward. My own research language ran through the captions like a stripped wire. Guests turned as I entered because people feel conflict before they understand it. Graham came toward me first with the smile he used on school fundraisers and emergency meetings, already trying to frame me back into a manageable role. He said we could still seat me near the family if I promised not to create confusion. I told him I had not come for a chair. I had come for the record. The phrase landed hard enough that 2 board members stopped pretending not to listen. Across the room, I saw Beatrice Carr lower her glass and realized the evening no longer belonged entirely to her. The board chair opened the benefit with the expected language about continuity, stewardship, and honoring Eleanor Carr through the preservation of Carr history. When Graham was invited to say a few words about the archive, I stood before applause had fully formed and asked, as evenly as I could, whether the room preferred the ceremonial version first or the documented one. Silence spread in layers. Wealthy rooms do not go quiet all at once. They pause by rank. Graham tried to smile me down. Beatrice Carr asked staff to continue service. I walked to the front holding my grandmother's appointment letter, the accession log bearing my handwriting, and the memorial seating revision with her own note about surname restriction. Then I said what I had needed to say since the blank card touched the table, that the family had attempted to erase my place in the lineage while using my labor to sell a purified story of that same lineage to the public. I did not weep. I did not rant. I narrated sequence. I named dates. I read my grandmother's words appointing me keeper because history was not public relations. The difference between pain and proof transformed the air faster than any accusation could have. Donors leaned forward. Board members began comparing documents. The family, for the first time all week, had to react instead of choreograph. Then Harold Wexford, the donor who had funded the digitization project, rose from the front table. He asked the technician to replace Graham's exhibition title on the main screen with the original archival credit, Adeline Carr, collection keeper. The room watched the gold letters disappear. My name filled the wall where it had been removed at the memorial. Beatrice looked at the screen. Graham looked at the floor. No one had to explain the reversal. They could see it. What followed was not cinematic chaos. It was better. It was the precise collapse of a false story under the weight of witnesses who suddenly understood they had been invited to fund a lie. Jonah confirmed the catalog trail. Iris Denton explained the metadata revisions. The conservator spoke about chain of custody. Maeve Larkin read the stewardship clause with the flat confidence of someone who knows theater dies when evidence enters correctly. Graham tried once to claim that many hands shaped the archive, and I answered that contribution was not the issue. Replacement was. Beatrice Carr attempted to recast the entire conflict as a painful disagreement over family language, but she had already lost the privilege of abstraction. The seating note, the altered credits, the private proposal, and my grandmother's letter formed one clean line of intention. I watched older donors realize the insult at the memorial dinner had not been about etiquette at all. It had been a test of whether I would consent to becoming invisible, so the approved branch could inherit not just property but moral authorship. When people understand that kind of theft, they do not hear legacy the same way again. Graham Carr was the first one to crack because men raised for inheritance rarely know how to stand inside shame once the room stops protecting them. He admitted he had known my surname was removed before dinner. He admitted the exhibition credit line was changed after my grandmother's death because the family wanted simplicity going into the benefit season. He even admitted they assumed I would accept a private settlement rather than challenge them publicly while mourning. There was no heroism in his confession, which made it more useful. He sounded frightened, smaller than the role they built for him, and painfully ordinary in the way entitled people often become once certainty leaves them. I did not take pleasure in his collapse. What I felt was something steadier and stranger. Release. Their power had depended on the idea that my knowledge needed their permission to matter. Hearing Graham confirm the plan in front of the board ended that fiction forever. Whatever happened next, no one in that room would be able to say I had imagined the architecture of my own removal. Beatrice Carr then offered the compromise she had probably intended to unveil in private once I was sufficiently worn down. She said the family could revise the memorial record, restore my archival title in the exhibition materials, and establish a formal role for me within the Carr Legacy Office if I would return the remaining boxes to estate custody and allow the matter to stay within the family. For one suspended second, I saw the old path open in front of me, re-entry, recognition, the seductive relief of being invited back inside the machine that had just tried to grind me down. A year earlier, I might have taken it and called that maturity. Standing there with my grandmother's letter in my hand, I understood how expensive that mistake would be. I told her no. I said I would not lend my grief, my labor, or my surname to any system that recognized me only after public exposure made denial inconvenient. I said the archive would move under independent stewardship exactly as Eleanor Carr instructed, and I would help that transfer happen with care, because I loved the history too much to leave it where truth had become negotiable. The room did not gasp. It breathed out. People had been waiting all evening to learn whether I wanted restoration or freedom. I chose freedom. The consequences began at once, and for once, they were practical rather than sentimental. The board suspended the exhibition launch pending independent review. Donors requested written corrections before releasing the next funding tranche. The memorial archive was amended that same night, though I made sure the original program and altered seating record were preserved alongside the correction, so the family could not pretend the injury had been a misunderstanding. Staff who had spent years avoiding my eyes began coming to me quietly with additional notes, backup files, and stories about how often Eleanor Carr had referred to me as the future keeper when no one from the principal line could be bothered to learn the collection properly. None of it restored the dead. None of it erased the ache of knowing how easily the family used my love as a lever against me. But each consequence mattered because it shifted the burden. I was no longer the woman proving she existed. They were the family explaining why they needed me silent in order to look legitimate. 3 weeks later, I unlocked a new reading room at Iris Denton's museum with the same key I once carried into the memorial dinner. The first temporary exhibition was modest by Carr standards and infinitely more honest. We called it keeping the car record, not because I needed triumph stitched into the wall, but because accuracy finally deserved a public home. At the entrance sat my grandmother's fountain pen beside a small card that read Keeper, Adeline Carr. Full name, no apology, no family permission attached to it. I stood there before opening hours with my palm on the glass case and let myself feel everything the benefit had not allowed time for: sorrow, anger, relief, and a quieter pride than revenge stories usually promise. I had not destroyed the family. I had done something harder, and, to me, more just. I had refused to let them inherit my silence along with the silver. When visitors came through that afternoon, they read the chronology in the right order for the first time. And when I wrote my surname in the guest ledger at closing, I understood what the memorial dinner had never been able to take from me. They could remove a card from a table. They could not make me surrender the truth of who I was